Hi, Autumn. Please state your name, your major, your year, and where you're from.
Okay, my name is Autumn Smith. I am an animation major. I am a junior, and I am from Franklin, Indiana.
How did you end up in this class?
So I had our professor Jackson Bartlett before for a different class. And so when I saw his name on like the options to take this class, I guess mostly because of class was. But knowing Bartlett's history for like the topics, it was safe to say he was probably going to talk about racism because I think he has an African American history studies or something like that.
Uh, what did you expect coming in?
Um, Nothing too much different than what we've already been learning, essays about like anti-racism and like learning the history of racism. There were quite a few things that did surprise me though that I wasn't ready to learn. Well, not ready, but just wasn't expecting to learn about.
Hmm. We'll get to that a little bit more later, but right now, can you describe this class for people who are not in it?
So it's not just like going through the process of the class, it's not too much different. We read material before the class, we enter the Zoom meeting, and then we talk about the material. It's just that this material is more specific to racism and anti-racism and the history of how it interacted with our society as the United States of America.
Moving on now, what was your hometown or neighborhood like growing up?
So my hometown is Franklin, Indiana. I was born and raised here. Um, it's not super big. It's not super small. It's a very like, it's kind of like more out in the country. It's not like a city or anything. You have the main downtown area, and there are like suburbs around there, but everywhere else is kind of like country land with farms and stuff. So as you would expect, it's has a more conservative political climate here.
Yeah, I would understand that.
Not very diverse either, mostly white people. There are a few people of different races and ethnicities here, but mostly just white.
Well, that was my next question. I'll move on. Did you think about race growing up?
Um, Not too much, other than when in history class we would be learning about slavery, and during that unit, that's required. Um, I think maybe one of the few times as like really young I thought about race. I think the first time I ever thought about that was seeing a black Barbie for the first time and being like, huh, that's new. Because I remember seeing all these like white dolls, and it was my first time seeing a black doll.
So that was probably the first time you ever thought about race or saw yourself or someone else as raced.
Yeah. Um, I think my main thought with it was that something seemed off to me about the Black Barbie. And looking back, I didn't really know why, but now I think it's because she wasn't really like black per se. She was kind of more like the opposite of whitewash, like a blackwashed Barbie. She was brown, but she still had the super straight, long, shiny hair, and her eyes were really light.
Hmm, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Did the people around you talk about race growing up? And at
No,
all?
just never really came up much. Didn't really have a reason to with my all white family and their white world.
Uh-huh. So probably you haven't experienced a whole lot of racism or like seen it in your life.
No, at least not personally. I, of course, seen it on the news and heard about it, but I haven't witnessed any acts like in person in real time.
So how does your race, obviously you're white, but how does that shape your experience? But also, how does that work with you being a female, a white woman?
Um, Gosh, let me actually like think about this for a bit.
Absolutely.
Oh no, hold on. My cat is trying to break into the room. I guess we're just gonna have to let him. I can't really stop the interview to stop him. But
I guess, like, what has your experience been as a white woman in America, in Indiana?
yeah, I mean, I've had a pretty decent upbringing. So I never really noticed sexism at first because at home, it almost seemed like the traditional gender roles were reversed. Like it was always my dad who was cooking dinner, and my mom had like the higher paying job. And she was also kind of like, she's more of the stern and strict one compared to my dad. We usually think of being like, I'm the man, this is my house, but no, it's my mom who kind of rules the house with her iron fist. So I already had like a great female role model to like look up to as a strong and independent woman. And so when I first started noticing sexism, then I immediately knew that was wrong and didn't think I should just, keep my head down and be like, I'm a woman, I should be feminine. But where exactly was I going with this? So I don't really know how exactly to compare that like to race. Because even with like my own experiences of being looked down on with like for being female, it could still never compare to like how bad it must be. Like, where am I going with this?
Well, we can move on to the next question. That's all right.
Yeah, it's just my experiences don't lend themselves to being a complete translation of knowing what it's like. But I can empathize. I can't speak, but I sympathize and empathize. Yeah, sympathize and empathize with them, knowing that it's bad, and because I know it's bad, I can still speak up and talk out against it.
Did this class like point out the experiences of, or I guess, sexism and racism that you didn't realize before?
So, just coming to college in general kind of helped me learn more about racism and sexism, like being intersectional. Because the year before, in a different honors class, I had read um, The Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison, and there were issues about racist sexism and that. And then, so coming into this class, I was able to learn more while already having a foundation about those intersectional issues.
Hmm. So I guess with this knowledge, one of the questions that Professor Bartlett wanted us to ask was one of the themes of this class is that race structures our global society. Um, it's not just something like on the outskirts of life, outskirts of America. Race really affects everybody, as racialized groups, especially um, because, like, often white people are just the norm and black people are raced. Um, so, I mean, that has been something that has been set up globally. So, I guess my question is that, I guess he says, we're all living in a society and we all have the capability to imagine and help create something different, a more equal society. The question is, where does your hometown fit in that society, and where do you fit in making these changes?
So with my hometown, as I mentioned, it's a bit smaller, more like in the country and conservative. So, and there are a few like black residents. It's not completely 100% white, but I can imagine that because of the upbringing that most of the residents have, that they could be racist towards those other black residents. So I'd say this town fits within the spectrum of leaning more racist. And so it is kind of my one of my duties of a civilian or a citizen of this town is to look towards the action other people in this town take and do what I can to speak out against it. And I remember, during the when I was when the protests were at their height during the summer, there was actually a smaller protest in town. So there's already some citizens like leaning towards anti-racism, just more need a push forward.
Hmm. So probably just more. Uh, I guess, do you need to be in having conversations more with people in your town, or what would a plan of action for creating a more just society look like for someone like yourself in the town that you live in? Like you said, small and more conservative.
Yeah, I mean, I can help organize protests or go to protests, but it would also help to write city officials, maybe those who are on the school board, and see like what curriculum they are teaching. Because I remember when I was in school, we didn't talk much about racism at all. And when learning about slavery, it was very like dumbed down to the point where we weren't talking about power structures and why racism came to be as a way to put white people in power and build up the elite class while using people of color as a scapegoat for why the lower class was more poor. It was really more of like, oh, well, slavery happened because these white people saw black people and they were different. And because they were different, they wanted to make them slaves when that isn't really the case at all.
So a lot of that requires like a change in education, is what you're saying. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you mentioned the protests, and just to move forward here, that has been one of the many events of 2020 from the pandemic. We said the protests, the election, and everything else. How has that shaped your perception of racism and anti-racism in the United States?
Um, Before 2020, I, of course, already knew that racism existed. I knew that police brutality existed. I remember the very first time I had heard about it was um, before with Tamir Rice, the little kid with the gun who was shot by an officer in public and killed. And I knew that there were people, not just police officers, but just the general public was racist, like with George Zimmerman shooting. I feel really bad. I'm blanking on the name. I'm being put on the spot.
Well, so am I now.
I do remember hearing that his mom was running for a like council spot in their town. Trayvon Martin.
Yeah, that's it. You're right.
Okay, there we go. Yes.
Well, did 2020 change your perception?
Oh yeah, that was where we were going with this. It didn't change my position so much as reminded me that racism isn't over with just because the civil rights movement happened, because it's technically illegal to be racist, like, and do discriminatory acts, but the same, like, murder is illegal, people still do it. Like, theft is illegal, people still do it. That's just not going to stop it. There needs to be a societal change overall, a cultural change. And I think 2020, despite all the bad stuff that happened, the protests also made other people aware, such as how it made me aware. And it's not the end, but it was a step to raising awareness that racism isn't over.
Yeah, what did it tell you about anti-racism, and have you been involved in any anti-racist actions or activities this year?
I have heard of people saying they're not racist before, and we have talked about how not racist isn't always the same as anti-racist, but I only began hearing like the phrase anti-racism this year and what it means. And I'm sorry, what exactly was the question again? With
It was,
anti-racism?
yeah, have you been involved in any activities that have been anti-racist this year?
Oh yeah. I did not participate in the protest in my hometown because I actually didn't know about it until after it happened. And I had wanted to go to Indianapolis, but my car was broken down. So the only protest I've been to was the one at Ball State that was like closer to the beginning of the year. Did you ever hear about that one?
Yeah, I actually attended that as well.
Yeah.
That's cool. Speaking of Ball State, how would you describe race relations or any race issues here at Ball State?
Um, it was just last year that the Black student was had the police called on him by a professor. So it certainly isn't like Ball State isn't completely free of racism or racist people. I know that. But so far, I at least haven't seen students being racist. So that's good. I think it comes with being part of the younger generations because I believe that professor was much more older than maybe even some other professors at Ball State. So I think it comes with just a different upbringing, for one thing.
Hmm. Well, I mean, your upbringing, you said it, not a lot of diversity and a lot of whiteness. Um, and that's pretty similar to what we have at Ball State. Um, has that, I guess, has there been more of a difference since you have gotten to Ball State and the way that you saw race? And the question is, how have you navigated that diversity, that whiteness at Ball State since you arrived?
Well, since coming to Ball State, there's definitely been much more students of color that I've seen around. And it hasn't really felt that much different. I'm not like distracted by them, like, oh, that's a Black person. I'm not used to that. I just kind of let them be just as I would any other normal person. It hasn't affected my education negatively or positively. And I'm like really glad about that because it proves that you can coexist without it being some big deal. But I would really like to see it, keep going, keep happening. It's really nice that we get to interact with people that we otherwise wouldn't if we stayed stuck in a homogenous, like little hometown.
Hmm. Do you think so? Like, do you think Ball State does a good job of creating a culture of belonging?
Um, it really depends. Like I said, there was the professor who didn't generate that area of belonging, but I haven't seen any students. Like, it depends on like student groups and like other things that are happening. Um, my brain is locking up all the words I need to know.
Well, let's get back to this class, this course. What has it meant to you?
I think it's really nice that this class is happening because not many other places of education, at least not at the university level, offer classes like this to learn about the history of racism and why race exists. This class never would have existed in my high school or in schools for kids of younger ages. And I think classes like this are really important for people who maybe grew up like from places I live that are very homogenous in their white population because it raises awareness to facts about race that you would have never even known if you hadn't taken this class.
Oh, what are some of the main things that you have learned this semester?
Um, I already kind of knew about like the carceral state, how, you know, prisons are mainly populated by like Black and brown people, but I learned more about it because of this class. Something I did not know before was how the foster care system and child protective services targets families of color. Um, I learned about the history of race and why it exists. Like I said before, we weren't taught that in school when it came to slavery. It was just very dumbed down for us. So learning that also opened my mind up to how racism came to be, and it isn't just an us versus them. It's a power struggle that most people tend to turn a blind eye to.
What has been probably um, the biggest thing that you have learned, like the most important thing, something that surprised you even?
All the things we learned in class. I'd say the biggest thing was just learning about the history of racism because that's the foundation for this entire class. You can't have a ism in any society without there being a history to it. And knowing the history to something makes it easier to like know how to move forward. A lot of people tend to overlook history because it's the past, But a lot of times it's the past we have to look to know how to change the future so we don't repeat history.
And well, looking forward, what do you think it means to be an anti-racist?
What it means to be anti-racist is not just being not racist. You have to actually actively pursue anti-racism, because otherwise you're just enabling racism to go on by not speaking up. Because even if you don't agree with it, not speaking out against it just lets it continue. So for the future, continuing to be anti-racist is the best way to end racism, because we have future generations and they're just gonna, keep perpetuating racism without even realizing it if we just stand by and think that racism is just going to end if older generations die.
So what are some of those anti-racist changes that you can make that we need to make as a society?
We need to go through and look through policies that have a racist structure and change them so that they are not racist anymore. We have to look at societal standards that are racist and change this, like the status quo. We have to teach and educate an anti-racist history. Like, as I mentioned before, we learned about slavery in a way that wasn't anti-racist. We simply were giving down watered down facts. And I think that, would help us to learn to be anti-racist if we learned all the bad instead of just saying, like, hey, slavery was bad. Let's move on now because it's abolished.
Mhm. Yeah, it sounds like education is, one of the main things there. Do you think, s all students at Ball State should have to take this class and have it be mandatory?
I definitely think a class like this should be mandatory, because a lot of times it's ignorance that breeds hate. Or in some cases, there are people who actively choose to be racist because it puts them in power. But the average person, like you and me, could benefit from this class a lot.
Uh-huh. Do you think we should teach, this class and about race and anti-racism even before college?
Definitely. I think it should start younger, because ages like around middle school is when you begin to start thinking in the ideologies of racism or sexism, because that's all you hear about from your peers around you, and it starts to mold you as a person. And so not saying we need to teach little 6-year-olds about all the bad things about racism, but it definitely would help to like start changing the curriculum to where it teaches us more about it.
Mhm.
But then maybe like middle school would be like the best place to like put put everything down and start discussing like in like full adult conversation about racism and anti-racism.
If you could, would you change anything about this class?
Um,
If anything?
Nothing I can think of. Like, I'm sure the structure would be a little bit different if it wasn't online. So I wouldn't know what like a classroom setting would be, but just reading the material and discussing it is has been really helpful, hearing other people's opinions and what they thought and how they think.
Hmm. How did we create an environment that was conducive to talking about race because it's a hard subject?
Yeah, I think you really just need to leave any like hangups you have at the door and just come in with an open mind and try to be ready to learn instead of blocking out information just because you might not have been raised to know that this stuff is real, and that because it completely conflicts with your background doesn't mean that you should just close yourself off to it.
Last few questions here. Where do you see Ball State, Muncie, Indiana, or the United States in 10 years from now?
Um, Being a college campus and a place of learning, I can see Ball State with the help of its students, like being more accelerating towards an anti-racist state. I think the US as a whole may take much longer because you have a larger population to get to. And I'm really hopeful that things will change as the younger generation like takes over, because we saw all those protests and most of it were people our age going.
Where do you see yourself 10 years from now?
Where I see myself, for one thing, I want to be an animator, so I'll be creating cartoons. And I think a big part of anti-racism is positive representation in the media of people of color. And so, as someone who's going to be making cartoons that younger children are going to be seeing, I want to create storylines and characters that support an anti-racist like ideology, such as a Black character that isn't a caricature or stereotype, you know?
Hmm. So you're saying you are going to remember this stuff.
Hmm.
Is there anything else you would like to say before we finish this up?
Um, Not that I can think of, no.
Thank you for your time and good luck on your future endeavors, Autumn.
Okay, thank you. Bye.